Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is October 10th, 2011, and my guest is Nicholas Wapshott. His latest book is Keynes Hayek, The Clash That Defined Modern Economics. Nicholas, welcome to EconTalk.
Thanks very much.
As our listeners know, I'm very interested in Keynes and Hayek, so I very much enjoy reading your book. It's a real tour de force. You've taken a very complicated set of ideas from both men and done a superb job making these ideas accessible. Let's begin with their early years, their relationship. Keynes was the older man. He was world famous after he wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which was his condemnation of the Treaty of Versailles after the end of World War I. Hayek at this point is a young, aspiring Austrian economist, literally from Austria, who's invited to England to challenge Keynes's voice in favor, who's arguing for a larger role for government in fighting the Depression. What happened when Hayek came to England, and how did he get there? Who invited? Talk about Robbins' role in inviting him.
Yes, there was a new professor of economics at the London School of Economics called Lionel Robbins. He said he was the youngest professor, and that's true professor in Britain at that time, and he was about 30. And he was determined to ensure that the LSE had a good reputation, which it already had, but it was a reputation that he didn't entirely sympathize with. Robbins was unusual for an English economist, and that is that he actually read German, and so therefore he'd read a lot of Austrian economics, and he realized, I think, that the Anglo-Saxon understanding of economics was missing an important dimension in Austrian economics. And he also looked north at Cambridge, an hour north of London, to see what Keynes was doing, and Keynes was making leaps and bounds in challenging the orthodoxy of economics, mainly for the practical reason that Britain was enduring in the 1920s vast amounts of unemployment. It would continue right until, of course, the end of the 30s. And so it was a deliberate intention for Robbins to woo a good Austrian economist to challenge Keynes, because he wanted the LSE to be the counter-Keynes, if you like, the natural place for people who didn't belong to Keynes's line of thought to coagulate. And that's why Hayek was called for. There might have been other Austrian economists who are probably more distinguished than Hayek.
Well, Hayek's teacher, Ludwig von Mises, was not his exact teacher, but his mentor, certainly his intellectual mentor. Why? Do you have any idea why he was not the choice?
Well, nobody's ever written any of this down, but I think you can speculate. The fact is that Mises, of course, was a much grander figure. He was, first of all, he was sort of fully employed. He was integrated into the Austrian government and helped, in as much as possible, manage its very tricky economy. Austria-Hungary, of course, had disappeared in 1918 at the end of World War I, and Austria was left like a head without a torso. It was a very tricky economy to manage. And Mises, an extraordinary person in terms of his resolution about his position, had a lot of things on his plate, including looking after people like Hayek, who he encouraged and coddled and even helped him in his love life. When Hayek was courting, he invited the young couple around their home in order to make sure that they're solidly fixed. But Mises was a very grumpy sort of character. He was always falling out with people. Even his wife, who wrote a very generous memoir about Mises, said that actually he had black moods and sometimes was just insufferable and for no reason had an angry temper. And I think that maybe that was against him. Also, he didn't really speak English very well. Now, we know from Friedrich Hayek, from movies of Friedrich Hayek, that even late in life, his accent was very, very strong. And you have to listen very acutely in order to understand exactly what Hayek is saying. But Hayek had at least spent a year in America, and so he had, at least according to Lionel Robbins, enough English to be able to make his way in London. It is a moot point, though, what would have happened had Hayek been a true English speaker, because what he was up against in Keynes was probably one of the most eloquent, articulate, intelligent opponents that any intellectual could ever, I suppose, wish for, because there's nothing better than having a very sharp person on the other side of the tennis court, as it were. But
and he was all those things, plus he was, partly because of those things, he was incredibly charismatic. He attracted people around him who wanted to be around him, who enjoyed hearing him. He was a tremendous conversationalist, right?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think there's any doubt that, and it actually rather complicates this story. There's no doubt that Keynes is an amazingly seductive figure. If he'd only lived one life, it would have been extraordinary, because he was a most imaginative thinker. And so all of his economic work was way outside the box, which is exactly the sort of thing that people like you and me and you and I enjoyed to play with, as it were. Yep. But he did other things too. He was a civil servant. That is, that he worked for the state, very often for no salary. After 1918, he didn't work for a salary. He was a close advisor to a lot of political figures, including the people at the very top, the Prime Minister, leader of the opposition, and so on. But he also spent every morning in bed. I must say, an enviable position. He used to sit up in bed until noon with a telephone by his side as he worked out what to buy and sell. He was an amazing speculator. It is ironic, I think, that of the two people, Keynes is the person who's always described as the person who tinkered with the market and interfered with the market, which is true, and Hayek was the person who would prefer for the market to let things rip, let things happen, let things naturally evolve. But of the two of them, Keynes played the market. He understood the market, particularly in currencies, so well that he built up two fortunes, one after the other. He lost one in 1929, and within 2 years he'd made it back and more. And he used this skill, too, to help his friends in the Bloomsbury Group, people like Virginia Woolf, E.M. Forster, his lover, Duncan Grant. He was homosexual. He was homosexual for half his life, and then he was heterosexual for the other half of his life, Keynes. I mean, Keynes had everything simultaneously, it seems.
Covered a lot of ground.
They covered a lot of ground.
Wrote a book on statistics. He had wide-ranging intellectual interests. So Hayek is a strange choice in the sense that he doesn't speak English very well. He's better than Mises maybe, but not very well. He gets to England, and he gives a famous set of lectures. And as you point out, he gives another lecture in advance of that doesn't get as much publicity. Talk about the two sets and the reaction he got. Well,
he was hired rather like a gunslinger, like a Western gunslinger, to come and take out Keynes. I don't think there's any doubt that what the LSE wanted Hayek to achieve was to provide an intellectual framework from which people who opposed Keynes could have a very good grounding in the ability to look at the weak points of Keynes. So when Hayek arrived, instead of going straight to the LSE, which is what you might imagine, which is where he'd been invited, he instead went straight to Cambridge, where he gave a lecture right in the heart of John Maynard Keynes's world, to the Marshall Society. Now, Marshall was in Anglo-Saxon terms anyway, he was the person who knew everything about classical economics. As all the Keynesians always used to say before they became Keynesians, you'll find it all in Marshall. And the annual Marshall lecture was a big deal. And Hayek was asked to give this, and he gave it, and he completely baffled everybody. He was talking concepts that they'd never even heard of. And that, and the combination of his thick accent, the fact that he had a bad cold at the time, the fact he'd only just arrived in Britain, slightly confused maybe, what with one thing and another, this large body of Keynesians, many of whom called themselves the Cambridge Circus, who surrounded Keynes and who were his acolytes, I mean, true disciples. We're talking here devotion way beyond what any normal teacher could expect from his or her students. In the midst of this lion's den of Keynesians, Hayek laboriously, meticulously, as was his Austrian way, laid out on a blackboard exactly why, if you were to provide either cheap credit or if the government were to directly intervene in an economy, why things would go wrong before long, and all of the industries that you would encourage by cheap credit would go bust. And as he pointed out, the wonderful word that everybody who ever heard Hayek in these days called fluctuations, which is what Hayek called it, the fluctuations, the business cycle, was actually something that you really could not, however much you might want to, iron out the top and the bottom of the business cycle. The fact was the business cycle was as if a natural phenomenon, and it was very difficult to deal with.
And this
the Cambridge people weren't much impressed with this, and they met with him mostly with silence. They didn't even jeer him particularly. They were just absolutely agog because they couldn't understand a word he said.
And this is 1930, is that right?
1930, yeah.
So one thing that was interesting to me, and I've been learning about this as Keynes has become back in the news because of the current recession. Keynes's ideas, his great book, the General Theory, comes out in 1936, but he's thinking along interventionist lines long before that. And in the late 1920s, a book comes out in America advocating spending and the evils of saving. And Hayek writes a review of it. It's not published in English for quite a while, I think, But he writes a review of it that's really an anti-Keynesian argument. The American economist and businessman who written this book, which name escapes me right now, we'll put a link up to it, they had made what essentially was a Keynesian argument that savings can be bad and spending is good. Hayek had answered it, and I think is part of the reason he's invited. So he continues this dialogue, which now becomes with Keynes, eventually soon becomes with Keynes himself, because he's asked by Robbins to review Keynes's latest book, which is the Treatise on Money. So talk about that review, which is really quite something.
It is, and I think it's worth bearing in mind that when we think today about the profound division in terms of economic argument in the political world between the left and the right, between those who believe there should be another stimulus to the American economy and those people who believe you should pay off debt as fast as possible and put the economy back to its natural state, as it were, we might think they're vituperative. And if you really want to know where it starts, it may well have started just right from the very first shot that Hayek took at Keynes. They had briefly met. They'd already started to argue, which was rather interesting, even on their first meeting. Now, this is not unusual. I mean, these are academics, and they're very open public academics, and you might expect them to want to argue. But the fact that the very first thing they did was argue was extraordinary. But here he set in the LSE's learned journal, Economica, he wrote a total condemnation of Keynes without quite getting to grips with what Keynes was talking about. That is, he said that it was, first of all, he wrote it in two halves, which probably was a tactical error. The first half, he really listed a whole collection of things saying, I don't know what Mr. Keynes is talking about. I don't know whether Mr. Keynes means this or that when he talks about investment or savings or whatever. And so he really didn't get very much past the first base, but the absolute blank hostility, the absolute strict counter to Keynes was already laid down. It's true that he built on work that he'd already done. It was a natural thing for him to do.
But it doesn't read like, and I think it's important to appreciate the tenor of this conversation and the back and forth from both sides. It reads more like a nasty set of blog posts than the way we traditionally think of academic life, either today or then. As you say, right. It's dismissive, it's critical. It's okay to be critical in a review. Most people are of books they don't like, but it has a almost personal tone and certainly a openly critical tone. And it was only the first half. Absolutely. And it was scathing and it was sarcastic. And this comes, by the way, this is a different age. We're talking 80 years ago now. John Maynard Keynes was very well brought up. He was an old Etonian and he went to Cambridge. Now, in English terms, there's not much more grand than that, really, unless you also had a country estate, which they didn't have. But, I mean, he was very well-mannered, very haute bourgeois. You know, he was way up there in terms of good manners and so on. But at the same time,
Keynes had such a viperish wit, a tongue to him, that he was, and he found it very difficult not to use it. I mean, Lord Clark, Kenneth Clark, once said of him, Keynes was never capable of dipping his headlights. There was a dazzle about Keynes, and he could not resist. If he saw an easy prey, an easy target, he took a pot shot at it. And Hayek, from a similar perspective, he too was bourgeois. He came from a family of professionals and academics and school teachers. And the Austrian way, in any way, is to be meticulously polite about everything. So it was extraordinary, in a way, that these two men who, in normal circumstances, if they'd met socially and didn't know what each other did for a living, would have been entirely charming. But from the get-go, the debate between Hayek and Keynes was poisonous. And so he wrote the first half, and no sooner had he written the first half than Keynes read it and wrote a riposte, so that the riposte was published very shortly after the first half of Hayek's critique was published. And Keynes was...
This is an unbelievable thing, actually, right? Because he ends up... Go ahead, sorry. I find it so amusing.
Keynes was sort of flabbergasted. I think that he was not used to being treated in this way for a start. He was used to be treated with some reverence. And he could not believe that this guy who just arrived off the boat from Austria, and the first thing he did was to send a bazooka in his way. It's worth reading at great length. I mean, the economic arguments are so dust dry that...
convoluted, I have to confess.
Does anybody understand them? I mean, I don't think even anyone at the time understood them. In a way, I think it's obvious that Keynes and Hayek don't quite get the grips with them.
No, I found one thing I have to confess is that I'm not a big fan of mathematical economics, and I've talked on the program many times about my preference often now for what I often call, for my colleague Dan Klein, Smith-Hayek economics, which is more narrative, more conversational, more observing the world and less pretending that it can be made rigorous through math. But having said that, I found they're confused back and forth. I almost longed for some mathematical rigor because it's as if one was talking in English and one was talking in German, and they were totally they didn't make a lot of headway. That's the lesson, the thing I came out of their debate with. They at that point, they didn't make many advances on where their points of disagreement really were. So Keynes answers, and his answer is an attack, not so much a defense, but it's an attack on Hayek, right?
Instead of taking into account what Hayek had observed about his own theory, he attacked Hayek's theory, which he called the greatest muddle that you could ever come across. He said this is bedlam. This is argument ad absurdum, which means that you get nowhere. It's barely worth talking about.
But he's attacking
immensely dismissive.
He was attacking Hayek's recent book, right?
Yeah.
Which, it's sort of like, okay, you review my book, I'll review your book.
I'll review your book. It started off petty and then went downwards.
Okay, so then the second half comes out.
So the second half then comes out, and it's a bit late by then because it's very difficult to catch Keynes' attention for very long because he's very busy. But the second half of Hayek's assessment came out, and actually in the second half he does get more to grips with the problems about what happens when a government intervenes in an economy and starts disrupting the natural order of things, as it were, blowing things out of proportion, putting levers in the wrong place, making readjustments which were untenable, But by then it was probably too late. By then, he'd lost all of Keynes' sympathy. Keynes was under the illusion that, and actually wrote this, that he thought that he had not been given the fair mind, the open mind, that any person who had written a book might expect from an academic reviewer. He thought that Hayek had already made up his mind that he wanted to get Keynes, that many of the things that he was criticizing of Keynes' thoughts he didn't properly address. It was an ad hominem attack on him, an attack on him as a person rather than as a thinker. And so the second and much more substantial part of the review arrived to a bit of a thud, really. I mean, Keynes by this time, although he was sort of intrigued by Hayek and did mention to someone in a letter, he said, this is a great farrago of nonsense, but I can't help thinking there's something in it, and which showed an extraordinary honesty on Keynes's part, because he was interested in getting to the bottom of things, to getting to the truth of things. But what he was, I think, irritated by Hayek was just this sort of blanket condemnation, this to arrive out of nowhere and just say, no, it's if you start doing any of the things you suggest, things will only get worse.
But I'll remind the listeners, we're talking about not Keynes's famous book, but rather the treatise on money. And Keynes did concede, I assume to his colleagues and friends, if not publicly, that the book was flawed. And part of what I understood from your book, part of the reason that he does not counter back to Hayek is he said, okay, I'm going to write a better book. And he was already well into it.
It's true. Keynes was actually at his most prodigious at this time in terms of new thought. He was moving very fast. And as you know, with publications of books particularly, I mean, there's a gap between when you finish writing and when it arrives in bound copies. And already by the time that the book that Hayek was criticizing had arrived, Keynes had moved on, and actually says this very clearly in the preface, which is another reason that he didn't give Hayek any credit for having condemned him so much. He said he hasn't taken into account the fact that my mind is constantly changing. On this subject, I haven't come to any deliberation yet. This is just thinking aloud, if you like. And this was all clearly explained in the preface of the book, and Hayek took not much notice of that. And Hayek, again, Keynes thought that Hayek had treated him very poorly.
So
they then had a little to and fro, and very interesting. I mean, these are people writing day by day. I mean, this is like email, except that it's hard copy post office. You know, I mean, twice a day, the poor postman was going up and down, you know, the King's College Drive, delivering letters from Hayek and vice versa, Keynes to Hayek. They were mostly, though, it's almost like shadow boxing. Again, they were just tweaking each other. If you've ever seen, I don't know, a cat playing with a mouse or something, or a cat playing with a dog even, you know, a puppy and a kitten together. It was a bit like that. They would go over and sort of thwack each other and run away. And, well, that set the tone for the next 80 years of debate, really, between the two sides. And I must say, although all the people I know on both sides are amazingly charming, when they come to discuss each other's work, it still remains at a level of sort of vituperative hysteria, if you like, which, well, it's usually amusing, I suppose, and it certainly raises the stakes. But I'm not sure that it means that you get any closer to discussing clearly exactly what the merits are on either side.
Yeah, we're going to come to that because I think that's absolutely right. But let's talk about the general theory. So Keynes, in collaboration, one of the things interesting about your book, you talk about the collaborative process that Keynes is involved in with his colleagues and how they helped him work out some of the nuances of the general theory. He after doing all kinds of writing for the general public and helping with politicians, Keynes writes a book that he claims at least is for economists, for his colleagues. He tries a different approach. He writes the general theory. And it is it's a bombshell. It lands with great force and impact. And so I want you to talk about two things. One, how the profession reacted to it, which is, to me, one of the most interesting parts of the book, and the famous silence of Hayek in the face of it. So talk about those two things. Okay,
so the general theory, published finally in 1936, but it took most of the early 30s to write it. And Keynes was determined, having, as you say, tried to cajole the public in general, talking directly to them, saying, you know, we need to increase demand if we want to cure unemployment, go out and buy something, and then trying to convince governments that they should be changing policy in order to spend more taxpayers' money, or borrow in order to spend taxpayers' money on public works and so on. This came to not very much, and so he thought, I'm going to take the long route. What I'm going to do is to persuade academics, and the academics in turn are going to change the world. And, well, he did it. It's a very confused book, I should say.
Almost unreadable.
Almost unreadable,
to a modern economist, let alone a modern reader. It's who's a normal person.
But that turned out to be part of its charm.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Because, and all sorts of Keynesians will say this. In fact, famously they did. People like Samuelson would say it. The great Keynesian textbook writer, said that because it was so complicated, because it was so difficult to get to grips with, that was the secret of its success. It's an amazing thought, but it seems to be true.
I have a sociological story, and I'll let you react to it. And part of this comes from the way you describe the reaction. The world is, remember, it's 1936. We're about to enter what we now call a double dip. In 1938, in America at least, there's a second recession that's very, very bad after the Great Depression starts. There starts to be some recovery starting in 1933. It's steady, and then in 38, again, the economy does very, very badly. So we're in that period where in the 30s, where around the world, things have been bad for a long time. There's a lot of shaken faith, whether it's legitimate or not. There's a lot of, as there is now, a lot of shaken faith in the virtues of capitalism and free markets. And this book comes along and says it doesn't have to be this way. Government can make it better by spending more money. And there's necessity is the mother of invention. I feel like the clamor and thirst that was for this, and the thirst that was slaked by its appearance, was due not so much to it being true or proven or empirically right, but it was the right medicine. It appealed to a lot of people. Is that fair?
I think that's absolutely fair. In a way, it wouldn't have mattered too much exactly what it said, because the important thing was that someone was coming up with a coherent, or apparently coherent, explanation for why things need not be as bad as they were, and giving a pretty clear plan to governments about exactly what they might do in order to cure unemployment. And this completely fitted with the public mood that just wanted something to be done. And it also fitted with somebody like Franklin Roosevelt, who's not a great economist. I don't have to pretend. And even when Keynes went to see him, he didn't understand what he was being told. On the other hand,
a very good politician, not the best economist.
Brilliant politician. Exactly, brilliant politician who just knew that, and that's why he tried a sort of scattergun approach. He said, I've been elected because people want me to fix this, and I'm going to try everything. If some things work, fine. If they don't work, it doesn't matter, because the whole thing is that people want to see that I am trying to solve their problem for them.
And I think for maybe 40 years, Roosevelt's reputation was sustained by that trying was enough. At first, it was believed, I was taught, it was in the air that he had, through the New Deal, cured the Great Depression. Then the received wisdom became, well, he didn't really do enough. It wasn't real Keynesianism. It looked like it, but it wasn't really Keynesianism. And that's why the economy didn't recover sufficiently. But at least he tried, and that optimism that created was sufficient to help the recovery. I don't think either of those is correct. Obviously, monetary policy had, I think, a bigger role than either of those. But it's good folk tales. It makes a good folk tale.
So where do you stand then on the double dip, the so-called Roosevelt recession?
Yeah, it's hard to know. Some people blamed it on tightening of money. Some people blamed it on, if you're a monetarist, you blame it on money tightening. If you're a fiscal Keynesian, you say, well, he raised taxes and foolishly tried to balance the budget. And that's what provoked it. I think it's very hard to know. I don't think we'll ever know. But I think that those are the two stories you hear.
Yeah, he certainly rode back from his original rather bold efforts of trying to create jobs, and he cancelled that. And also it was when it seemed that the figures were moving in the right direction, I think he seemed to ease his foot off the gas.
Well, he's a politician. He's risk-averse. I think he was hopeful that he could, get by without having to keep doing things that he was worried might end up blowing up in his face. So he retrenched, but who knows? It's hard.
We're talking about the general theory because it is interesting, the collaborations, as you say. This really wasn't all Keynes. Keynes was the driving force, undoubtedly, and he also had a sort of one of those umbrella minds that could sort of embrace a whole collection of things all under a single unit and combine them together so they appear to have a coherent whole. But I suppose the principal amanuensis was Richard Karn.
Somebody I'd never heard of until your book.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'd never heard of him.
Oh, really?
He's lost to modern graduate economics, I'm afraid.
Richard Karn was the guy who actually took an idea which had been floated by Keynes in the 20s, really, as a sound, practical political suggestion to the Liberal Party about how to get people back to work. Keynes came to the conclusion that every pound that was spent by a government to create jobs was not worth just a pound, because, as he explained it a number of times, if you paid the butcher would then pay the candlestick maker, and the candlestick maker would then buy something from the corner shop, and the corner shop would buy something from the dry cleaner, and so on. So he worked out, again, this is something that you and I would probably recoil from. He actually tried to work out specifically what that figure would be, and he came to a conclusion that 1.4 in Britain, anyway, that every pound would be worth more than that.
Yeah, that's the multiplier effect.
That's the multiplier effect. Now, Richard Karn took this and said, oh, this is very interesting, but he hasn't proven it. And so Karn went away. Karn, a pretty good genius, I must say, in his own right. And he went away, and he worked out how that would be the case. And it's a very interesting and very elegant proof. It might not be true, by the way, looking back on 50 years.
Well, they often forget that the dollar often came from someone who isn't going to spend it. And that's the famous critique of Wapshott. It's the famous critique of Henry Hazlitt, the writer who was an early critic of Keynes and was eager to dispel the idea that there was this free lunch because of the multiplier. But Cohn worked a lot on this, obviously, and one of the things that comes out of the book is that there were a lot of conversations constantly going on between Keynes, John Robinson, Richard Cohn, and others in this circle of folks that influenced Keynes and helped him work these ideas out. And that's part of the collaborative process, just sort of interesting in its own right.
Also Keynes, it should be said, because it's what we're trying to do here is try to work out why the general theory got such acceptance so quickly. There's no doubt that Keynes was an astonishingly good salesman. He was terrific at marketing. He discovered, I think, when writing The Economic Consequences of the Peace, first of all, the more lively you make the writing, the more likely people will take notice of it. But he was also very good at the pre-publicity. He was very good at the op-ed article in support of the argument and so on. And there's no doubt that he made sure that everybody knew that he was coming out with a magnum opus. And he also gave, up to the final year of writing the book, he gave a succession of weekly lectures at Cambridge, which were filled to overflowing with people who were conscious that they were listening to something that was historic, which undoubtedly it was. I can't think of anything more thrilling, actually, for you and I to sit now in that lecture room in Cambridge and actually listen to what was being said and how it was presented. If you can have regrets about this stuff, the fact is that today, of course, everything would be web streamed.
Yes, it would.
And so we'd be able to see all of this stuff. We'd see Hayek and Keynes floundering around with each other's arguments and knocking them on the head. It's been very thrilling.
And it clearly, and you recount many examples of the exhilaration that academics felt when they encountered these ideas for the first time of Keynes or read the book for the first time. What I find remarkable is, I alluded to this earlier, it really isn't like Einstein lecturing or, to take another example, Andrew Wiles lecturing on Fermat's last theorem, where you realize you're at a historic moment. It was a historic moment, but the evidence for the claims, of course, is very different. Economics isn't as scientific as physics or math. And the enthusiasm for people of the older generation, and there was a generation gap here as you chronicle, the older generation sat there puzzled, I think, saying, well, I'm not sure this is right. It's certainly wrong by our usual past standards of what's right. It goes in the face of everything I've learned. But the young people ate it up like popcorn. They could not resist it, and it carried the day.
Absolutely. When the books arrived in boxes in Harvard, they were pounced upon. Well, you have to move on to something like, I don't know, the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper or something. You have to think of
Harry Potter, maybe.
Harry Potter, or maybe an iPad, you know?
Exactly. People lining up for it.
They could not, and there was, and there's no doubt, there was a sort of Steve Jobs element about Keynes, that they just adored him.
Yeah.
They just thought he was, and the interesting thing too was that many of the opponents of Keynes, including people like Nicky Kaldor, who actually helped Hayek amazingly with his original review and critique of Keynes, and helped him with a number of other important translations. But he started off as a Hayekian, and then he switched over. Yeah. And everybody in the end switched over, including Lionel Robbins, even. I mean, with amazing reservations. Lionel Robbins was a very sentient fellow. But at the same time, he said, I am sorry that in the 1930s I resisted a policy which might have made life easier for people.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge part of this, is you've got somebody suffering. Somebody comes with a new cure, a new medicine. It could be shock treatment. It could be radiation. It could be leeches. Yeah. But this person's been suffering for so long, and you say, well, I don't think that's going to work. That person is drowned out by the applause for the new technique to some extent. I think there's more to it. I don't want to be unfair to Keynes. Obviously, there was a great deal of creativity in his work, but clearly part of the appeal was the fact that he had a new cure for something that people desperately wanted fixed. Yeah. So here's this puzzle at this point. We've talked about this on this program before with Larry White and maybe with Pete Boettke. I can't remember, but certainly with Larry White. The general theory comes out, and Keynes's natural opponent, F.A. Hayek, is silent. Nothing is heard from him about this book, which is a book that is a devastating intellectual challenge to his whole worldview. He has already responded to previous efforts by Keynes, and yet he does not review the book and does not write on it. And one thing I learned from your book that I did not know is that Robbins, rather than asking Hayek to review the book for Economica, asks A.C. Pigou. So talk about that and then Hayek's silence.
Yeah, as you can imagine, Keynes was such a manipulator of public sentiment that he knew that there was nothing like controversy for attracting people to your cause, or indeed for encouraging people to buy your book, which is pretty simple, and therefore get to grips with your argument. And therefore he sent Hayek proof copies of the general theory, saying, you may be interested in this, fully expecting Hayek to come back over the top as he had 6 years before, with a wonderful, devastating critique.
And certainly the first half of Hayek's review of the Treatise on Money could have been just reissued, almost in critiquing Keynes by saying, I don't know what investment. Although you point out Keynes went to great pains to try to clarify some of those issues.
He did. I think that Keynes, for once, was actually trying not to. This wasn't smoke and mirrors. Where in the past, it may have been, he may have been happy for it to be smoke and mirrors, his ideas. But this time, I think he really wanted people to get to grips with what was really a genuine revolution in the way that we understood economics. I know that we can look at all the various bits of the general theory and point out that each of one of them is flawed and it doesn't provide a coherent whole. But the outcome of the general theory was a total change in the way that we understand economics and the relationship between governments and the economy.
Yep, absolutely.
There was no such thing as macroeconomics.
Yeah, I'm going to come to that. Well, okay, let's talk about that now.
Let's just stick. Yeah, okay. We're sticking with why Hayek didn't do anything.
Yeah, we'll come back to that macro part.
Which is jolly difficult. And if we had Hayek here with us now, I mean, it's something which I suspect that even if we had an hour with him, we still wouldn't quite get to the bottom of it. He gave a number of explanations over the course of his long life why he really did not go for Keynes when it came to the general theory, which after all was the big idea, the big notion, and the big challenge, as you say, to his own thought. And he's made a number of barely credible things. He said, I was worried that just like the previous book, he would say, I've changed my mind, and so, I didn't even bother. That doesn't really hold water.
Yeah, it doesn't help.
I think that what does seem to be clear is that one of the things that was thrown up by the original debate between Hayek and Keynes was that they both came to the conclusion that there were elements of capital theory that needed to be addressed properly. And Hayek himself set out on in what he thought was going to be a substantial new work on capital theory. And he just got so bogged down in it that by the time that in 1936, he was I guess he was rather like I am now. He was blocked for knowing exactly what to say. He had I think it was a much larger mountain to climb than he'd ever imagined. He found it less interesting than he was expecting, and he just got bogged down in it. And when the book finally came out, nobody took any notice of it. And I think that it was in contrast to what Hayek looked across at Keynes and saw this sort of this facility for explaining himself, this clarity, this public acclamation, this Keynes being raised to people's shoulders and carried, high in public esteem. And I think that all of that didn't help Hayek. Hayek was sort of frozen in inaction, if you like. I think that's the nearest I can get to why he didn't actually do anything about it.
Well,
he snipped around the edges, and the whole of his life he kept going back to the general theory, picking off this bit or that bit. But what would be ideal and what would be amazingly helpful today, looking at the problems that we have, is to have Hayek's proper, definitive checklist of why the general theory was wrong, and I'm afraid we haven't got it.
Yeah, it's funny, as you were saying that, I had the exact same image of your opponent being carried off on the shoulders of the crowd with the cheers and the delight, and you're standing in the corner and you want to say, but wait. But
exactly.
Nobody wants to listen to you. That's number one. It's very demoralizing. You figure, well, I'm going to write this. I'll write my own great book, and it'll answer it. And I don't have to answer it right now. Time is long, and of course it is. Turns out the debate does get more complicated as the next 50 years go on. But he figures I'm on the process of finishing my great book, and that'll be my answer. And as you point out, that book is a muddle. Hayek wasn't particularly proud of it. It didn't come out the way he thought. And my claim, I don't know if we don't, as you say, we'll never know, but my claim is that Hayek in that book was trying to create what has always been the gold standard, which is a microeconomics-based theory of macroeconomics, an individual decision-based theory of how the overall economy behaves. We're still in that struggle right now in economics, and he couldn't do it. And there's nothing to be ashamed of. It's perhaps too hard. And he comes to that view, I think, in the 1974 article, his Nobel Prize lecture, and The Pretense of Knowledge. He basically says, it's really, to me, that's his answer to Keynes. It's not a literal answer, but he says the economy's too hard. We don't have the knowledge to understand the underlying processes, and we should concede as much. And that's his real last word on macroeconomics. Yeah,
I think that, if you were only to read one piece by Hayek, I think that Nobel lecture actually probably is the most interesting, the most honest, most candid, and the most thought-provoking of them all.
It's a glorious piece.
And when he describes, they were both capable of thinking up similes or metaphors which would allow them to describe a very complex conceptual notion so that regular people could understand it. When Hayek describes in his Nobel lecture that in order to understand economics, it would be like knowing, this is what my opponents do. They look at a football team and they find out all the vital statistics of all the players involved. They find out what the weather's going to be. They find out everything else that they could possibly know, the temperature of the grass, everything they know, but they still can't predict what the result of the game is going to be. Because actually, economics activity is about individual choices, and the only thing you can be certain of is that prices are trying to tell you something, because at least two people agreed on it.
Yeah, and he says in that essay, in that lecture, that if you had all the knowledge, if you knew what the people had eaten for breakfast and what their metabolism was doing that day and whether they had a fight with their wife or that, their muscle tone, maybe you could really predict what the outcome would be, but we'll never have that level of knowledge, and it's true about the economy as well.
Which is a sort of contra-scientific thing altogether, isn't it?
It is. Well, it's a statement about the limits of reason, which is a theme that Hayek gets involved in his philosophy over that time period, right? He goes through his fascinating time in the wilderness that you write about, which is roughly 36 to 76. It's a pretty long time. Kind of like the Jews in the desert. In the desert, it's about 4 decades.
40 years.
Yeah, it's about 40 years of wandering, and in that time, he explores all kinds of other stuff. Right, he gets into neuroscience and philosophy, and he writes books of political economy writ large. And one of the themes of all that work is the limits of human knowledge and the importance of recognizing fundamental unknowability and fundamental uncertainty that can't be resolved by science.
Yeah, I mean, it is the great thing that his failure to address the general theory and then the failure of his big economic theory book himself, that's what leads him to actually what turns out to be the thing that he's really best known for today, which is a totally different, a non-economic study of people in society. And how the economy is involved, but this is not economics.
Right.
And this is what he wrote during World War II. He was an Austrian. He volunteered. He was by no means a Nazi sympathizer or anything like it. I must say that I crawled all over it. There's no anti-Semitism, although one might expect it out of such a family in Austria.
Ironically, Keynes has some anti-Semitism in his past, in his youth and his adulthood. Yeah.
But he's very honest about it. I mean, the great thing about Hayek, there's absolutely no side to him. He never tries to, as Keynes does all the time, Hayek never tries to portray himself in a better light, and he's constantly confessing to things which you think, well, I don't think I would have mentioned that.
Right,
and so when it comes to the middle of the war, he said, I was in an absolutely ideal position, you see, because I was Austrian, so I was not allowed to fight, but at the same time I had all this time, and everybody else was busy, so I had the place to myself. He went to Cambridge and lived up in Cambridge and so on. He had a, if you can put it that way, he had a good war, and the result of it actually turns out to be the thing that he's remembered for most of all, which is the Road to Serfdom. Yeah. Which is a shame because I don't think it's as close to his best book, and it's the one book people read, and it's an interesting book. It was important, and obviously made a big splash. Talk about that book and how it indirectly became a counterpoint to Keynes. Yes, You've got to look at Keynes and Hayek, I think, through the two different lenses of what they were trying to achieve. Keynes always wanted to ameliorate the lives of others, and he was particularly offended by unemployment that he thought was unnecessary. So joblessness was what Keynes was worried about most of all. Hayek was worried about something else. He was worried about, and experienced it, and he and his family experienced it in Austria directly after World War I, and that was rampant inflation, and what that does in terms of undermining the economy to the general society. He saw Austria cut adrift, losing all of its regular social coherence and becoming prey to extremist thought, revolutionaries, mobs. And looking at the world after World War II, which was what he then did during the years of World War II, he was trying to work out what it was about both Nazism and Soviet communism that they had in common. There was a misconception that he came across among many British academics that somehow communism and Nazism were at opposite ends of the political spectrum. And he put them straight on that and said, no, they are identical, and what they're identical in, and the reason they are so tyrannical, is that they remove people's ability to operate freely within the free market. And on that relatively straightforward thought, he built a case against really any attempt for governments to interfere in economies, in as much as it curtails the individual's right to take part in the market. And he said that was the road to serfdom, a road to tyranny, if you like. And just to clarify one thing, he never said it was inevitable. It's a cheap shot against him that somehow, because we're not all enslaved, the book was wrong. It's a strange idea. It's not what his theme was. No, exactly. No, he was very subtle, actually, what he was saying. He said that incrementally, roughly, the more a government takes out of the hands of taxpayers their own money and spends it through planners, as the planners can't possibly know what genuinely the needs are of the taxpayers who gave up the money in the first place, that there is a disconnect, and that very often that can tend towards tyranny. But this is all tending. There was no absolute position in that. And then, of course, there are many things in Road to Serfdom which many people who say they're Hayekians or even have read the Road to Serfdom don't seem to have grasped. Yeah, and then he said that there are basic things that, in order for, if we rely upon the market to keep society honest, if you like, then there are various things that you have to take out of the equation. That is, that people should at least be able to have a roof over their heads and have health care and some form of social security, which the state should provide. That is a deal breaker for so many people today.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I get a lot of emails from people who send me that paragraph. They know I'm a Hayekian in some dimension. It turns out many, but not all. And they send me that paragraph. They say, well, what about this? And I say, well, maybe he's wrong. Or, it's not, he's not God. He doesn't, his words are not, perfect. He's not infallible. And it doesn't, so yeah, maybe he had some inconsistencies relative to my position. I don't really care because I'm a skeptic about the virtues of government-provided health care and Social Security. But
I can imagine, yeah.
But he certainly conceded that. He was very adamant that he was not a conservative. So conservatives who take him to their bosom are probably missing out as well. But he obviously in his writing at times was willing to countenance many, many roles for government. And I think one thing that's nice in your book is that Keynes takes him to task on that. So talk about that.
Yeah, Keynes...
famous letter that Keynes writes.
Exactly. There was a quid pro quo because just as Keynes had sent Hayek an early copy of the general theory, so Hayek sent him a copy of The Road to Serfdom, which he read on a transatlantic boat. So it's not a very long book, actually. It couldn't take him very long. And he wrote twice about it. First of all, he darted off a letter immediately saying, this looks really interesting. I think you're onto something here. I look forward to reading it. And then he read it and he said, this is a really splendid book. And I'm so glad that you pointed these things out because you have spotted something which is really important. That if government keeps growing and growing, then of course there is an enormous danger. If government is in the wrong hands, the wrong sort of people, as we've just gone through World War II, we know what we're talking about, that you're absolutely right. There's a truth here. And many congratulations. But then, just as Hayek is preening himself a little, thinking, goodness me, Keynes said something nice to me, he then says, but actually, of course, what we don't need is less planning. What we need is more planning, because the more we plan, the more we can ensure that the economy is healthy, that people are happy, and altogether that will allow them their freedom.
And he also challenges Hayek, I think, philosophically, saying, well, if you say it's just a question of where you draw the line before you risk being on the road to serfdom, we just agree it's at a different place, right? Exactly.
Yeah, he did. But he used that example, of course, when Hayek said that there are basic things that the state ought to provide. I mean, he does say, of course, which is essential, which is that the protection of the state itself, that is defense, is a key thing that every state must have. But then when he goes on to say these other things, that's when Keynes pounces and says, oh, I see, so you can see that there should be some form of social security, that there should be some form of pension. Oh, I see. So in which case, yeah, well, I think, aren't we both on the same side, really? It's just that you're a little further over there and I'm a little further over here.
And there's some truth to that, of course. And neither of them, Keynes wasn't a socialist and Hayek was not an anarchist. So in that sense, they're close to each other, but of course, still pretty far apart.
Vast. Gaping chasm between the two of them. But it's another interesting thing, and it was interesting that also by this stage how much more generous Keynes is towards Hayek. I mean, the passing of time, all sorts of things happened, including World War II, which I think was traumatic for anyone who lived through it at whatever age or whatever occupation. But those two being, particularly Keynes was intimately involved in the management of the war from the British government point of view and the borrowing of money from America, and also trying to work out what the post-war world would look like in its various institutions. Keynes was integrally involved in all of this.
That's right.
And I think that and it probably did reflect, and the generosity of the letter did reflect the fact that Keynes was riding amazingly high, as he had done, now for a couple of decades.
Right. He could afford to be Hayek, a little bit
exactly, he could patronize Hayek a bit. Hayek was, wasn't he that old Austrian guy who came and started to cause trouble those years ago? And so he is very generous. But all of that, of course, comes to an abrupt end because in 1946, Keynes drops dead, age 62.
Yeah, and there's this famous conversation where Hayek reminds Keynes of the dangers of inflation, and Keynes says, "Oh, don't worry, I'll temper the excesses of my fans, my followers with ease, because I'll just dissuade them from their positions." And he doesn't have the opportunity because he's gone.
Yeah, that's I suppose that would be true of almost anyone who had a cult following behind them. I can handle them. Don't worry about that.
So at
but
this
there's
point,
no doubt that the Keynesians then took over from Keynes.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about this is, again, is just sort of pure intellectual history, is that at this point, Keynes is certainly at his death, at his zenith, although there's some real good years left to come for his reputation. Hayek had a little bit of a comeback because The Road to Serfdom has been quite a success. But the world moves in the Keynesian direction for the next 30 years. Governments get bigger, they get more interventionist, and they spend a lot more. Yeah. That comes to an end partly through the championing of Hayek's ideas by Thatcher and Reagan. But the standard story, and I'd like to get your reaction to it, the standard story is, well, and then in the 80s, Hayek was on the rise because Reagan quoted him and Thatcher quoted him. But the fact is, government still got a lot bigger. It didn't get as big as it could have gotten. We didn't head toward the kind of planning at the national government level that many people advocated, industrial planning and various variations on that. But it was not a golden era of laissez-faire from 1980 to say 2000. It was just a slowing in the rate of growth.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, Hayek's response when, of course, he was constantly asked about Reagan and Thatcher. And he always went out of his way to say that he didn't do any advising for them, that he was no part of their economic team. The first thing he said was to snap immediately, nothing to do with me, those two, which is not what one would expected because there's no doubt that both Reagan and Thatcher had read Hayek.
Yeah, actually had read him, yeah. And we're fans of him. Yeah. And we're fans of his work. There's
genuine fans of him, and also wooed him. I mean, they met him, and Thatcher certainly ensured that she saw him on a regular basis. But the fact is that, Reagan and Thatcher were still spending a hell of a lot. And actually, I think they missed out on some of the essential elements of what Hayek was trying to tell them.
And I interviewed Milton Friedman in 2006. Friedman appears a number of times in your book as clearly somebody who's sympathetic to Hayek's political economy, not so sympathetic to his monetary theory, although they have a little bit of overlap in that they're both skeptical of the virtues of easy money. That's for sure. So when I interviewed Milton in 2006, shortly before he passed away, I was recounting how many of his ideas in Capitalism and Freedom, a book written in 1962, I think, how many of them had come into the mainstream and how half full at least the glass was. And Friedman's reaction, akin to Hayek's, I think, was, yeah, look how many of them didn't happen. Look how little progress we've made in stemming the size of government and government regulation. We're almost out of time. I want to ask you one speculative question, and then we'll close with a general question. The speculative question is, I was fascinated when I interviewed Bruce Caldwell, this issue came up, and you mentioned as well that Hayek, for reasons of romance, spends a year I think it's a year, but certainly some time, teaching at the University of Arkansas in order to get an easy divorce and remarry the love of his childhood, of his young adulthood life. Do we know anything about his life in Arkansas? Do we know anything about? I'd love there's somebody alive today, maybe hundreds of people who took Hayek's economics classes in Arkansas.
I must say, I've never come across anyone ever. Have you?
No,
There's no trace of this at all.
No,
Hayek, the lost year, or Hayek, the Arkansas year would be great.
Yeah, and I was thinking it'd make a good movie. This Viennese intellectual in Fayetteville. I'm fascinated by it, but could be our next book, Nicholas. The other historical episode I wanted to just quickly ask you about is Schumpeter, who you don't spend a lot of time on. Schumpeter has a sort of parallel experience to Hayek. He's got this great book on business cycles that he thinks he's going to write, and it also just sort of falls apart. It never coheres, and he publishes it to no effect, seeing himself as the great intellectual rival to Keynes, but the world doesn't see him that way.
No, I suppose if Lionel Robbins had blessed him, it might have been different. I mean, I think there's no doubt that the institutional framework that Robbins provided for Hayek to counter Keynes has meant that, in the end, we look at Hayek, even better than Mies, actually, as being the counter to Keynes, even though they don't entirely fit.
Right.
The general, I guess Mies is the granddaddy of all this stuff anyway. And so actually it should be Mies versus Keynes, but for a number of reasons that didn't work out.
Well, he had a lot of sparring partners indirectly, right? Friedman certainly becomes one, although Keynes is gone by then. But Friedman certainly ends up battling Keynes in his own way and cutting him up a bit. I think quite a bit. It was we didn't talk about it, but obviously having the intellectual work of Friedman to fall onto when the Keynesian story fell apart in the 70s with stagflation played a large role in the ascendancy of Friedman's work and its influence.
But don't forget that Friedman also wrote a very generous essay about Keynes.
Well, that's a nice segue to the issue we left in the middle of our conversation, which is that Keynes invented macroeconomics. I think it's important to make it clear that the classical economists certainly were very well aware of the business cycle, were very well aware of the fact that there could be unemployment and how bad it was and the human toll it took. But there is a sense in which Keynes, quote, invents macroeconomics. What is that sense?
Well, the sense is that he just started looking at the whole discipline of economics from a different position. It's as if he'd hovered sort of 10 foot above the air and looked down on economics rather than looking at it from ground level. He looked at the big picture of economics. He worked out that an economy was made up of different parts, different moving parts, including money. And the interrelationship between all of these elements was the key. And that is why he was suggesting that if you were to inject a little more money here, you would get a little less unemployment over there. And so he saw it as if it was a machine, a large construction. And that's the way that that's macroeconomics. That's the way the big picture is the way that we understand economics. To that extent, all economics today that is used is macroeconomic.
Yeah, I like the way you described it because it's a phrase I'm fond of. You talked about Keynes's view of macro being top down and Hayek's being bottom up. That's a little unfair to Keynes because obviously, and modern Keynesians, obviously they try very hard to introduce individual behavior into the aggregate story.
Well, they've had to do that because of Hayek, actually. I mean, they've had to do that because so many people complained you're only looking at it from above.
Yeah, but it's a useful way, I think, to think about it. And
that, of course, led to the other thing, which Keynes disliked and Hayek disliked even more, which was measuring the economy. It stands to reason that once you've worked out that this is the equation on which it's all based, it's amazingly complex, well, people will start trying to fill in what the various values mean and start logging in an economy various figures, various measurements. And in a way, economics, which is all macroeconomic, it's true, but all economics today is sort of modeling. It's econometricians trying to measure different bits and pieces. An economist who gets hired today by a business is mostly crunching numbers or trying to find a model which will provide some vision into the future so that people can invest better.
And today is Monday, October 10th, 2011, and the Nobel Prize was awarded this morning to Thomas Sargent and Chris Sims for that kind of partly for that kind of enterprise. But I find it remarkable how little direct empirical evidence there is for this debate that we're having. And this to me is the punchline to the story, which is we had this debate. It starts in the 30s. It gets more mathematical as we go through the 70s. The anti-Keynesian story, much of the anti-Keynesian story becomes an argument within the Keynesian framework, which Milton Friedman in some sense was. He was an aggregate his work was very much in the aggregate sense. But the ability to use econometrics to steer the economy or to assess the value of public policy. In 1976, Robert Lucas writes a critique of that attempt. That critique pretty devastating, and yet today we continue to have the same debate. There's a bunch of people who say the stimulus worked great, a bunch of people who say no, it was a total failure, a bunch of people who say we need to spend another $1 trillion, a bunch of people say no, we have to try something totally different, it didn't work. And the inability to use econometric techniques to settle that debate, to me, is one of the great lessons of the last 50 years. And most economists don't agree with me, but that's my take.
Yeah, no, I think I do agree with you.
Yeah, but it's not the mainstream view because it says it requires a level of humility and honesty in the face of the reality that most economists would prefer. Or I'm wrong. It could be. It's one or the other. Why don't we close? We're out of time. Why don't we close on a more personal level, I'd love your impressions of what kind of personal relationship Keynes and Hayek had, the level of friendship. They're so combative early on, and yet there are these episodes in their lives where they're socially interacting, and talk about their friendship.
Yes, because they did have a friendship, and it lasted, I guess, sort of 1930 to 1946 eventually, and it was a different friendship, a different sort of friendship at different times. I think that right at the beginning it was like two stags locking horns, and they actually never managed to wound each other because their horns remained locked. I mean, they didn't get any further than locking horns. But as time went on, I mean, all of these worlds, as you know, I mean, rather like economics today, or certainly Austrian economics in America today, a very small world. And the world between Cambridge and London was very small, and they did encounter each other very often. They even attended joint seminars which were held halfway between Cambridge and London, where the Keynesians and the Hayekians, or the Austrians, could meet in order to discuss all of these issues. Again, wonderful material which has all just gone to the ether. There are very few descriptions of Keynes and Hayek actually appearing before these groups of people. But they got on amiably enough and often found themselves on the same side of the argument, which is interesting. I think there was a clear change in 1940 when the London School of Economics was bombed out of London, and the whole college moved to Cambridge. And there, it's where Keynes extended a hand. As you may imagine, Cambridge is very stratified, like everything else in England. And so, however wonderful your college is, there's a pecking order, and the top of which is King's own college. By the way, another job he did, he was a bursar of King's, and he invested enormous amounts of money for King's and made a lot of money for King's, just in passing. And what Keynes says to Hayek, oh, you don't want to stay over in that college. Why don't I find you some rooms in King's? And I must say that is about as generous an offer as you can get to, never mind the fact that we've fallen out in the past, never mind that, we have our profound disagreements, which we will never come to an agreement on. The fact is, you're a decent sort of guy. On the other hand, he confides to his wife, Lydia, sat next to Friedrich Hayek in the hall yesterday at the top table in King's, still talking as much nonsense as ever about economics. But on other matters, they were very close, and they spoke about, they were both collectors of, or both interested anyway, in early economics books. I mean, very early economics books, which they would share. They would talk about book buying in general. They would talk about their travels and so on. So in the end, they ended up very amiable. And all the way through, Hayek, as much as he might have disparaged Keynesian's ideas, he was always very generous, not only to Keynes as a person, as a human being, but also to his intellect. And so when Keynes died, he wrote, as he well might maybe to Keynes's widow, but he wrote a very generous thing, saying that he was probably the brightest, the most intelligent man that I've ever come across in my life. And I tell you, if you're Hayek saying that of Keynes, that's a pretty big thing to say.
My guest today has been Nicholas Wapshott. Nicholas, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Great pleasure.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.